I wonder if you can hear me, Randy.
Yeah, I can hear very clearly. Can you hear me?
Good. Yep, I can hear you very well. So it appears that we have a technological success so far.
So far.
And,
never trust the technology.
Well, it seems to be doing okay. So you can hear me all right. Are you able to see me as well?
Yeah.
Good. All right. Well, I'm very pleased to welcome you all. I'm very delighted to see that there's a good number of people in the room from all over the world, by the looks of it, and some very very serious scholars, young and old, and famous people and familiar people. So it's great to have you all here, and I want to welcome you. My name's Nick Enfield. I'm Professor of Linguistics at the University of Sydney, and I'm in the Sydney Centre for Language Research, and we're very pleased to have this seminar today given by Professor Randy LaPolla. He, of course, as you are all here, of course, he needs no introduction. I will give him a little one. Randy is Professor of Linguistics with an appointment in Chinese in the School of Humanities at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. He was at La Trobe in Australia for many years, and he has held posts at the City University of Hong Kong and Academia Sinica in Taiwan. Randy was trained in Berkeley at the University of California in Berkeley, and his dissertation committee consisted of Jim Matisoff, Robert Van Valen, hello, and Joanna Nichols. So, you know, an incredible mix of people at the top of some really complementary games in global linguistics. So, you know, Randy has this incredible pedigree, and we've all been enjoying the fruits of it for many years. Today he works in Sino-Tibetan linguistics, in linguistic typology, in historical linguistics, in pragmatics, in anthropological linguistics. He's made advances in all of those fields and has received too many international distinctions and awards and grants for me to list here. But, you know, if you're looking for some inspiration, I recommend you go and look at his CV online. But I would point out that, you know, over the years, I've made use of, and I've indeed been inspired by some of the incredible publications that Randy's produced. I mean, the work that came out of his dissertation work on grammatical relations in Chinese was incredibly influential on me, thinking about how we understand grammars of the Southeast Asia area. He's really, you know, he's done the groundwork of writing grammars, his grammar of Chiang. He's done dictionary work, his Rawang English Burmese dictionary, with collaborators, of course. His incredible book together with Van Valen on syntax from, I guess it was 97. And recently I've been making a lot of use of the Sino-Tibetan languages volume, which came out as a second edition in 2017, co-edited with Graham Thurgood. It's an incredible book with a lot of value for anyone who wants to look at it. So we're benefiting all from the work that Randy's done. One more book I want to mention is the book that was published about 5-6 years ago, co-edited with Rick DeBusser, on language structure and environment, a topic somewhat close to my heart. The subtitle is Social, Cultural, and Natural Factors. So just some really thoughtful work in that book that I, would really highly recommend. And I think that today's theme is going to somewhat go to issues raised in there, but certainly issues that Randy's been developing for quite a long time. So it's my very great pleasure to welcome you into this virtual space, and I'm very happy to see everyone else here. So I'm going to hand over the floor to Randy, and at the end we'll have a little bit of Q&A. So save up your questions, and you can put them in the chat function there, and I'll see them. So let me hand it over to you, Randy.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much, Nick. That's very kind and maybe a bit over the top introduction. Wait, I'm trying to share. Can you see my screen now? My screen. Okay. Good. All right. So today, yeah, I'm actually going to be talking, as Nick said. So this is a little bit related to the book I did with Nick, Rick Debuser. The looking at language from a much broader perspective than just looking at structure. So this is also actually a part of a larger approach towards human behavior generally, because that's really what I'm interested in. I came into linguistics from philosophy, and I'm really interested in why people believe what they believe, how they come to believe what they believe, how do they create meaning. And so that's really been what I've been about for a long time, and trying to understand also how language works. But this talk, I'm going to be talking about more generally the creation of meaning. Wait, I gotta see how I can click it. So what is meaning, and how do we create it? Let's just take an example. This was a place setting that was put in front of me in a cafe in Manila some time ago. And I noticed something right away when it was put in front of me, that there's something unusual about it. We have generally a sense of a normality, like what is the assumed normality, what things that are normal. And when we notice something out of the norms, we will try to create some kind of meaning to explain it. So in this case, I saw that the serviette here had an impression on it. And so I immediately created the meaning that the waiter must have stacked the plates ahead of time to save time. Now, I didn't test the hypothesis at that point, but actually I found later in a cafe in Australia that they actually did the same thing. And there I checked. That's the difference between science and hypothesis. But I want to argue in this talk that meaning creation is a survival technique, because we are trying to always make sense of our world. In order to survive in our world, we're always trying to make sense of what's going on around us and how we need to interact with it, or in fact, defend ourselves from it. So when we see something out of the ordinary, you need to possibly defend yourself from it. It's survival. I mean, I haven't been attacked by too many serviettes, but still it becomes a habit. And I'll be talking a little bit about habit as well. We can only understand something by integrating it into our knowledge base or our experiences, which is basically the same thing, and our general system of beliefs. And so we do this. What we do is we create a context of interpretation, which is not the total context, but bits of knowledge, bits of the actual context, bits of information and the assumptions that we can put together so that whatever it is we're trying to make sense of can make sense. And doing it this way, of course, is always subjective. There is no objective way to do this. So cognition and the creation of meaning, there's inference and understanding our surroundings. And I argue again, this is a human instinct to try to understand the world through inference. And there are two types of inference, demonstrative and non-demonstrative inference, and two types of non-demonstrative inference, induction and abduction. This is really annoying that whenever somebody comes into the waiting room, my forwarding and backwarding gets messed up. In demonstrative analytic inference, also known as deduction, the truth of the premises guarantees the truth of the conclusion. And so it's just tautology. In other words, it doesn't really tell us anything. So something like all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, Socrates is moral. And a lot of attention has been paid to that, but it's not really very helpful. In non-demonstrative or synthetic inference, the truth of the premises merely makes the truth of the conclusions probable. And so this was the problem, because when this was first identified, Hume talked about the problem of induction, and in that time he included induction and abduction together in non-demonstrative inference. And so he called it the problem of induction, because philosophers like certainty, and you don't get certainty with this type of induction. Wait, hold on. Yeah. So Peirce, the one who separated abduction and induction, was the first to argue that these things are separate. And he said that the essence of an induction is that it infers from one set of facts another set of similar facts, whereas hypothesis infers from facts of one kind to another. Induction is generalization across a set of data. Abduction is positing a reason for some phenomenon. That is, it's causal reasoning. The main inference involved in meaning creation is abductive inference. Abductive inference is finding an explanation for the facts. That is, it's hypothesis creation. As Peirce said, there are just these three modes of inference, and neither deduction nor induction can furnish me with any new idea. Unless I can get to the bottom of things by hypothesis, I might as well give up trying to comprehend them. Now, Grice had a very similar idea, although he was a bit later, and seems independent. He doesn't seem to cite Peirce, but he says, and it occurs to me that the root idea in the notion of meaning is that if X means that Y, then this is equivalent to, or at least contains as part of what it means, the claim that Y is a consequence of X. That is, what the cases of natural and non-natural meaning have in common is that on some interpretation of the notion of consequence, Y as being the case is a consequence of X. And he says the consequence of Y, of X. So his basic understanding here is that consciousness is fundamentally an inference from effect to cause. And this is, of course, what underlies his cooperative principle, that people act rationally. Rationally to him means they do things with a purpose. You can infer what their purpose is, and so therefore you can communicate. So can I ask Naomi to turn off the waiting room? It's really very disruptive to me to have these things coming in and messing up the screen, and then also messing up my clicking forward. Is it possible to just open the waiting room for everybody, so we're not constantly going through this? Thanks. So another aspect of this, or one use, I should say, of abductive inference is to anticipate future situations by inferring the reason for some observable phenomenon. There's considerable psycholinguistic evidence for anticipation, or sometimes called prediction, in the psychological literature. And in fact, Andy Clark argues that brains are essentially prediction machines. And I'll come back to this and its use in communication later. Now, one aspect of the world where we apply this ability for abductive inference and also prediction is when we try to understand what other humans are doing, or might do, might do, by inferring their intentions when they do what they do. And again, this is necessary for survival. So again, I'm talking about kind of general behavior. We need to be able to infer. We're social primates, and so when we're interacting with other people, we need to be able to infer their intentions and, of course, our place within the society and whatever. But just a real example is, if someone comes walking at me with a knife in their hand, I need to be able to infer if they're going to cut me an apple or they're going to stab me in the gut. So this is part of what is necessary for survival. Now, this same ability, which I've just shown, is applied in understanding the natural world, but also understanding the human world. We can apply this in understanding what other humans are doing, in inferring their intention when they are purposely trying to infer. They get you to infer their intention. So they're not always trying to get you to infer their intention. But there are times when someone will purposely try to get you to infer their intention. And that's how communication happens. So let's look at another real example. I used to have a woman cleaning for me, not cleaning, cooking for me a few days a week. some time ago. And usually when I would come home, everything would be done, she'd be gone, and everything would be put away. But one day when I came back, I found that this container was still on the counter. And this was, again, out of the ordinary. So I needed to create some kind of meaning, some kind of reason for it being there. And so I came up with two hypotheses. One is that she just forgot to put it away. But the other one is, after looking at it and noticing that there wasn't a lot of rice, I hypothesized that she was trying to tell me that I should notice that there's not much rice, and then I should go buy rice. So I went and bought rice. And then the first thing she said to me the next time I saw her was, "Did you buy rice?" And so then I knew that my hypothesis was correct. But this is communication, and this is really all communication is. As Grice also noticed, he says, I want to say that the utterer, the utterer said that P entails that two, that the utterer did something X by which the utterer meant that P. But of course, many things are examples of the condition specified in statement 2, which are not cases of saying. For example, a man in a car, by refraining from turning on his lights, means I should go first and he will wait for me. So he's basically saying the same thing, that there's really no difference between the linguistic communication and non-linguistic communication. He says, surely to show that the criteria for judging linguistic intentions, which is how you communicate, are very like the criteria for judging non-linguistic intention. And it is to show that linguistic intentions are very like non-linguistic intentions. So basically, again, saying that there's little difference. So the nature of communication is simply ostension and inference. One person wishing to communicate something does what can be called an ostensive act, from Latin to show, ostendere. So you show the desire to communicate, which is also involves inference on the part of the addressee to recognize this as a communicative attempt. And then the other person, the addressee, must infer the communicative intention behind the ostensive act. Communication then is a process of ostension and inference regardless of the mode it takes. As communication is based on non-demonstrative inference, communication is inherently non-deterministic. Language simply provides clues for constraining the inference. Communication is not something that happens easily. As Karl Popper said, always remember that it's impossible to speak in such a way that you cannot be misunderstood. There will always be some who misunderstand you, because it's not a coding, decoding proposition. It's inferring somebody's intentions in doing whatever it is they did in the attempt to communicate. The degree to which the hearer is forced to abduce a particular interpretation depends on the degree to which the form of the utterance constrains the hearer in choosing the contextual assumptions necessary to achieve an interpretation that makes sense in that context. There has been a mistaken notion in linguistics that the meaning is all in the form, but this is certainly not the case. Let me use another real example. One time I was calling roll and I said, Alan, I called the name Alan, and a student in the back of the room just pointed at a chair next to him that was empty and said, toilet. Now, if we believe that communication is coding and decoding, then we must say that the meaning that I created is all in the word toilet. And the meaning that I created actually from his ostensive act, which is not just the word toilet, but the toilet and the gesture. In a lot of linguistic discussion, they separate the two, but they really are one ostensive act, the two together. You need the whole package. So from this whole package, this whole ostensive act, what I inferred was that Alan had been in the room, he had left the room to go to the toilet, but he is coming right back, and so I should not mark him as absent. And that was the whole purpose of this person using that ostensive act. Now, what was important about this is not the so-called meaning of toilet as a word by itself. If we look up the word toilet in the Merriam-Webster dictionary, we can find a lot of meanings. The dressing table, or an active process of dressing or grooming yourself, a livy, a water flush toilet that you defecate into. These are not what is important here. What is important in this example is that when he said toilet, I was able to include in my context of interpretation information that I know about how people use toilets. In other words, we normally will, if we're in a public space, we'll go to the toilet and then come back to the place we were. And we don't stay long. I mean, you could stay long in the bathroom if you wanted to, but most people don't stay any longer than they have to, and they often go back to what they're doing. So this is how I was able to create the meaning that he was coming right back, and I should not mark him as absent. Now, just think about how different my interpretation would have been if he had said canteen, or if he had said library, or if he had said especially home. Then I would not have created that meaning at all. So the so-called meaning of toilet is not really what's important here. It's that he mentions toilet because it's something that will evoke certain conceptions in my mind that will allow me to understand that he's coming back soon. So I shouldn't mark him as absent. Now, as I mentioned, recognizing the communicative act itself as a communicative act is inference. You need inference to do that. And recognizing the form of the ostensive act, in other words, identifying what it is, like what language it is or what the forms are. This is not so obvious to people when they're reading something that's typed or whatever, but if you've ever read a handwritten letter or something, especially in a foreign language you don't know that well, you can understand how much inference is involved in actually trying to understand what the letters even are in there. So the form doesn't need to be familiar. Because of this, the form doesn't need to be familiar to the addressee as long as the addressee can infer the speaker's intention. So we have things like this where this company put together these are Irish icons that they put together on St. Patrick's Day. And everyone that reads this probably can create a certain meaning out of it, but there are no letters here. There cannot be any coding, decoding. It's all simply inference from the particular shape, from the particular knowledge of the company and other factors that you can create the meaning that you do. And our creation of meaning related to all things, not just language, because again, I'm speaking very generally, is relative to what we know, what is salient to us, and our perspective. So, for example, when people, these were cushions I had in my house in the Philippines some time ago, and when people would see this, they would often say 525 if they look at it from this perspective. But then if they looked at it from a different perspective, they'd say 252. So it's really just whether you look at it from one angle or another, you create totally different meaning. So it means that it shows that the meaning is not in the form itself. In fact, these are not really numbers at all. But when we see something, we try to make sense out of it if we can. In this case, if you happen to know Arabic numerals and these images seem similar to Arabic numerals, we will try to create meaning out of it in that way. Another aspect of perspective is what is salient to us. So this is a picture of the new sports complex in my university. And when they first built it, they didn't give it a name. They asked people to come up with suggested names. And so we were talking about this one time amongst some of my colleagues, and one of my colleagues called it the Palette Building. And that had not occurred to me at all, even though I taught experimental phonetics and and whatnot, phonetics generally. But he was at that time, and he is an experimental phoneticist, and he was working in particular at that time on a paper about how the shape of the palate affects the sound that we find in languages. And so for him, the palate was the most salient concept that came to his mind when he was trying to create meaning out of looking at this image. The speaker, on the other hand, also makes inferences as to what the hearer will be able to understand, and then uses the ostensive act most likely to facilitate the inferential process of the hearer. That's the general case in conversation. In literature and humor, these are interesting exceptions because in literature and humor, you actually try to make the person do extra work, extra inferential work. And I think the reason for this is that just like with our other survival instincts, so we have an instinct for sex, we have an instinct to eat, and we enjoy doing those things. I think evolutionarily, it's a good thing we developed an enjoyment of doing those things, and so it helps us to survive as a species and as individuals. And I think with this instinct as well, we get pleasure from doing inference. And so when we read literature and when we are exposed to humor, we like doing extra inference. It makes us feel good when we can understand. So this is something that I think is tied to the fact that it is a survival technique. Now, communication can take place with or without language, as I showed, and functional MRI studies show that non-linguistic and linguistic communication are processed in the same areas of the brain, including those areas referred to as Broca's areas and Wernicke's areas, which have been thought to be related to language, but they're really more generally related to meaning creation. Language simply helps to constrain the inferential process to make it easier for the hearer to infer the speaker's intention. The difference between non-linguistic communication and linguistic communication is the difference of tool or mode, with resulting differences in precision, like the difference between ripping bread into pieces with your hands and cutting it carefully with a knife. The inferential process can be more or less constrained, but never constrained completely in a fully deterministic way. So even though, like when we write laws, we try to constrain the interpretation as much as possible, so there's no room for other interpretations, but yet we still need a Supreme Court to tell us what the laws mean. And the interesting thing is that different sets of judges on the Supreme Court can tell us the law means different things. So there's never a fully deterministic meaning. So a problem with much of the psycholinguistics literature is the assumption that meaning creation involving language is special, but they never compare it to meaning creation that doesn't involve language. My hypothesis is that if we did such a study, we would find no difference. And I did apply for funding 3 times. I applied for funding to do imaging studies. I was working with a neurological specialist in Canada to try to look at how abduction works in the brain, comparing linguistic and non-linguistic abduction. But unfortunately, I never got the funding. As meaning creation and communication depends on inferring the intention of a communicator performing some action, there is then no semantics in the sense of words or signs having meaning divorced from actual use by some communicator. That is, it's all pragmatics. When we attempt to understand something out of context, there's another reason why it's all pragmatics actually, is that really there are 2 things in linguistics. There's form and there's use. And form arises out of use, as I'll talk about in a minute. And so really it's all pragmatics, it's all use. When we attempt to understand something out of context, we create a context in which a possible motivation for the ostensive act would make sense. That is, we create its meaning by selecting a particular frame in which to give it its meaning. Okay, so now turning to the nature of language. What is language? Language is culture. What is culture? The culture is the evolved sets of social conventions for carrying out particular tasks, and language is the set of conventions for carrying out the task of communication. The rules of language and language use are evolved sets of social conventions for constraining the process of interpretation that have emerged out of our interaction, much like our social conventions for preparing and eating food. Language is not a fixed system, it's human behavior and changes constantly as it's an emergent phenomenon like other aspects of our group behavior. Our knowledge of language is simply knowledge of how words and structures have been used before to achieve a certain purpose. As Adele Goldberg said, our knowledge of language is knowledge. It's basically just like any other knowledge. We use this knowledge as part of the context of interpretation for inferring the speaker's intention and using certain words, but the meaning we create will be unique to that particular context and so extends the use of the words and structures. Language isn't purpose-built and it doesn't exist as an entity anywhere. It is constantly emerging as a side product of our trying to communicate. It's an emergent, complex, adaptive system like an economy or a path through a field. So a path through a field is a common parallel used to talk about language, like Rudy Keller and whatnot. But I actually realized this myself one day while walking across such a field before I read Keller's work. This is actually an actual field where I worked in Australia at La Trobe University. And it wasn't that people were trying to create this path. The idea of this is that people are just trying to get from point A to point B in the most efficient way. And if enough people do that, then the grass gets trampled and the path emerges. So over time, you get a much more clear path. And Nick has also talked about how once some people start doing this, it also attracts. It's also because, this also happens with complex adaptive phenomena. You have attractors. So it attracts other people to do the same thing. And so this thing can develop even further. But it's not that people try to create a path, it's just they're trying to do something, and this emerges out of the, as like a side product, and of trying to get from point A to point B in the easiest way. Now, it can become to be recognized, so a path through a field can be eventually paved, and with language, words can be put in dictionaries and grammar books are written, but that's just a snapshot of the uses of the words and patterns up to that point in terms of language. It's not really what, it of course should never be prescriptive or anything like that. Now, what gets repeated and what extensions of meaning are evidenced in the usages is related to the cognitive categories and construal of the world of the speakers. And so the patterns that get repeated will reflect the culture and cognitive construal of the people. And the language will embody the culture and conceptions of the people. And this is often talked about as ethnosyntax, and that's the title of Nick's 2002 book, Ethnosyntax. Now, borrowing can introduce new concepts and tools, but the ultimate meaning of the borrowed item will be determined by the use to which it is put. And so it's the same process as for native items. It's the meaning is use, which of course goes back to Wittgenstein, but even earlier than that. So we have words in English like gung-ho, which means to have great spirit or enthusiasm. It actually comes from the word gonghe in Chinese, which means industrial cooperative. And so it's very hard to see the link between the two, but it doesn't matter because once we borrowed the word gung-ho, it's ours. We can do whatever we want with it. And the same thing with the use of the fork and spoon in Southeast Asia. They have borrowed the tools, the spoon and fork in Southeast Asia, but they use them in a very different way. And so the meaning of the fork and the meaning of the spoon in their system of eating is very different from the meaning in our system. So these are just showing parallels in between linguistic and non-linguistic culture. Now, getting back to anticipation and prediction, the ability for anticipation is also a key factor in communication. As perception of a speech act is linear, interpretation is also linear. And this is why the initial segment of the utterance, the theme, is so important. The theme, as talked about in the Prague School linguistics, is the starting point, the speaker's starting point. It doesn't necessarily include topic. In my paper, LaPolla 2019, I argue that we need to separate topic and comment from theme rime, because there are languages like Tagalog where the theme is important in terms of packing certain information into the theme, but the topic is not one of those things generally. It occurs at the end of the clause. The reason why this is important is because we don't wait for the whole utterance to be completed before we start creating the context of interpretation. We start building the context of interpretation with the very first word, and then that context of interpretation influences the creation of the context for interpreting the rest of the utterance, including anticipating what is to come in the interaction. This is talked about in interactional linguistics as projection. And this includes two aspects: the ability to guess what's coming up in the interaction, but also the grammatical mechanism for helping the hearer to make such guesses. And I've argued that this is a typological parameter, that languages differ in terms of what they pack into the theme. So English packs a lot of information that tells you what the grammatical mood of the clause is with the first word and things like that Michael Halliday talked about. But it also, then you get a language like Tagalog where they do it totally different, but they're still, functionally, they're still packing certain types of information into the theme of the clause. And Hopper argues that projection is what makes verbal communication an open and collaborative affair. As so participants develop a sense of where the discourse is going, they tacitly mold it, allow it to continue, harmonize with the speaker's goals, interrupt it with their own contribution, offer supportive tokens of various kinds, or predict when their turn will come. So this is something that's been looked at quite a lot in interactional linguistics and conversational analysis more generally. Now, the flip side of this is that projection manifests as expectations, and these, along with the addressee's preconceptions, this original knowledge base, influence the meaning the address creates, and so it can get in the way of creating a meaning that the communicator hopes the addressee will create. And this is the origin and nature of unintended bias. So a lot of times we just do not understand something because we assume it means one thing when, because of our expectation, when actually it means something else, or it's intended to mean something else. So and this happens quite a lot. And if anybody's, this is Murray Gell-Mann, the Nobel Prize winning physicist, told me that the best way to get a rejection letter is to submit something that's totally new. And the reason for that is because people have no way to assimilate it. If it's totally new, you cannot assimilate something new. And so like when I first submitted this to language in 1997, this idea, the reviewers just had no clue about, it was just so alien to them that they understood it in a totally different way than I intended it. They kind of understood in a way that kind of made sense to them, which is nice evidence of the theory itself, but it didn't help me get a publication. Anyway, culture is habit. We are very much creatures of habit, and once we have a habit, it's hard to change, including habits of language and even thought. And these habits are, I'm not talking about just what we normally think of as habits like smoking or something like that. It's just, if you really pay attention to your activities every day and you become very aware of them, you realize how much of what we do is habit. So if you, and these become our rituals, like how you take a shower, how you brush your teeth, how you eat your breakfast, all of these things are rituals that we do. Now, what happens though is that our sensibilities arise from our rituals, because we tend to think that the way we do something is the correct way to do things, and other people that do it differently are doing it wrong. So this is a problematic aspect of this. Now, language use is also a habit, and they're very hard to change because it's a habit that we engage in almost every day of our lives from the time we're very little, and very commonly throughout the day, probably more so than any other activity. And so one of the simplest examples of the habits we form is in learning our first language is we learn to categorize certain sounds together as allophones of a single phoneme and to distinguish other sounds that our language treats as distinct phonemes. And this is entirely habit, but as anyone who has learned a second language knows, it's difficult to change a habit and make distinctions you're not used to making and hear distinctions you're not used to hearing. So these things even influence our perception. So for example, a native English speaker will hear a voiceless unaspirated stop like in Beijing as the same as a voice stop like in boy, as if they're the same sound. And they won't hear the difference, for example, in the 4 words in Mandarin, you know, mama, mama, which are different tones. I remember when they first told me that when I was a teenager learning Mandarin, and they said mama, mama, or 4 different words, I said, yeah, right. I totally didn't believe them. It took months before it just suddenly clicked in my brain. So these are habits. These are habits of perception, habits of thinking, you know, habits of seeing even is affected. And this is what's involved in second language learner accents, because it's habits of muscle use as well, how you pronounce things. The point is not that you can't learn another set of habits, it's just that it's difficult. And so there's no real critical period for learning language or anything like, or anything else really. These are all general. This is same for all other aspects of human behavior, that the longer you've had one particular set of habits, the harder it is to change. So in Taiji Chuan, they actually even say this, that to learn the form is easy, to change your form is difficult, because once you've developed habits, they're hard to change. And so this is true of language, but it's also true of, like there's a video online you can go to about a guy who learned to ride a bicycle that works backwards. So you turn the handlebars one way, the wheel goes the other way. And it took him 8 months to learn to ride the bicycle that way. But then, but his son who had just started learning to ride the bicycle, was able to learn it in only 3 weeks to ride the backwards bicycle. And in my case, my personal experience was like driving in the US for 30 years on the US side of the street, and then moving to former British colonies and learning to drive on the British side of the street. Even after 20 years of driving on the British side of the street, I'm still not fully comfortable with that. So don't ride in my car. I never feel as comfortable as I did when I was driving initially with my initial set of habits, because you constantly have to be using executive control to suppress one set of habits to allow another set of habits. And this is what's talked about as bilingual advantage, but it's also a kind of disadvantage because when you're in your initial set, you're constantly suppressing some other set. It's also difficult to learn a new way of thinking, especially if you try to do it using words and concepts that are part and parcel of the old way of thinking. It isn't that language fully determines thought. The language evolves the way it does because of the importance the culture puts on constraining inference in certain ways. And this process is always ongoing, as language is always changing. So the culture and cognition of the people, how they profile events, influences the language. But then once it becomes a convention for the people, a cognitive category for them, it is passed on to future generations, and so will influence how people think about those things and what they pay attention to. And we can see this very clearly in the work of, say, Melissa Bowerman, the late Melissa Bowerman, where she was showing how when children acquiring the categories of the languages that they speak, that initially they don't have those categories and they acquire them as they acquired the language. When we speak a language, we subscribe to the conventions of usage associated with that language, and those conventions influence the way we talk about things and ultimately how we think about them. So when I was a kid growing up in the US, I knew about shrimp, prawn, and lobster as my understanding of them was they were three very different animals. They have three very different names, and for us, they're three different concepts. But for the Chinese, when I learned Chinese, they're really just different types of different size xia. So there's a xia for shrimp and da xia or big shrimp, and then long xia, dragon shrimp, which just means really big shrimp. And when I learned this, it's like, I don't know, 18 years old or something, 19 years old, whatever. It was really a shock to me that people could see things so differently from what I had been used to. And this was kind of the beginning of my fascination with how cultures understand things differently. To say that the original development of a particular pattern is motivated does not imply that the motivation will always be transparent. In many discussions of ethnosyntax, the opaqueness of certain structures is taken to be evidence that it's not possible to show a link between language and other sets of conventions. Yet in many aspects of our lives, again, it's a general principle, once a particular way of doing something is conventionalized, the original motivation may be lost while the conventionalized behavior continues simply because it's already a convention, such as wearing a necktie, or the habit of pouring milk before the tea in Britain, or some of these things like when you buy nasi lemak in Malay areas here, like Singapore, Malaysia. It used to be wrapped in banana leaf, and people got used to that, but now they use paper, but they make it look like banana leaf. That's the thing on the left. And they used to have a guy standing in the road with a baton going up and down to warn motorists of construction sites, but now people got so used to that, so when they wanted to replace that with a non-human, they had to actually make something that looked human. This is what's called skeuomorphism. So skeuomorphism, the reason for skeuomorphism is because of our cognitive habits, that we expect something to look like what it used to look like, even if you change it. So even though you've changed the paper, you make it look like a banana leaf. Even though it's not a person anymore, you make it look like a person. And then we have also, just out of habit, we have these expressions like pig in a poke, pass the buck, put it in the hopper, stars in the firmament, carriage return, ka-ching, dial a phone, RSVP. Especially in Australia, RSVP means make a reservation. So they've made it their own. And then this image, what's called a floppy disk. This thing is actually not a floppy disk. It's very hard. So this is actually a double, if you can see my picture, this is actually a double example, because this thing is called a floppy disk because this was a floppy disk. This is floppy. And there was even an earlier one is bigger. I actually used these when I started computers. And so the first one was changed, but they kept the name out of habit. They kept the name floppy disk, even though it wasn't floppy anymore. And now young people have probably never even seen one of these disks, but we still use it as our icon for saving whatever it is on our computer software. And then we have examples like in phonetics, like the word for crow in Chinese is now pronounced wu, but we can reconstruct that in Old Chinese as ah. So it's probably onomatopoetic at that time, but it's no longer onomatopoetic, so we don't see the motivation for it anymore. But it's still there historically. And then the word for bank is literally silver company, because in the past they dealt with silver. All exchanges were done with silver, but they no longer use silver, but they still maintain that name, Yinghang, for silver company. And in the during the pandemic, they were talking about different cases of people who are in an isolation ward, and this person said, he was not lonely because my mobile was buzzing and ringing off the hook. Now, if we look at phones, in the old days, we had hooks on phones that you could hang up the receiver on, and we still say hang up the phone. But the modern phones, of course, have no hook, and so, but we still can use hang up the phone. We still can say ringing off the hook, as this person did. It's just purely habit. So the motivation is not always obvious, but we continue our habits. And of course, there's also been talk about perseverance in grammatical phenomena as well, where morphology gets layered because we maintain the old morphology, even if it becomes kind of meaningless to us or not so useful, and we keep layering other morphology on top of it. Okay, so now Christian Lehman asked me, how do we study languages using this this way of looking at things? Now, Roman Jakobson said that languages differ essentially in what they must convey and not in what they may convey. But this is looking at it from the speaker's point of view. From the hearer's point of view, we can say that languages differ not so much in what can be understood, but in what must be understood, or what the speaker needs to constrain the interpretation of. And so each language has its own history of development, just as societies differ as to what tools they use for a particular activity, for example, using chopsticks as opposed to using your hands, or a fork for eating. And these tools can vary in terms of specificity. The tool we think of as language can differ between societies in terms of how specialized the structures are and to what purpose they have conventionalized. Conventionalization, which includes any usage really, but it subsumes grammaticalization and lexicalization. It occurs after repeated use. And since it takes more effort to constrain some aspect of the interpretation rather than not, it must be important to the speakers to constrain that aspect of the interpretation. Otherwise, they wouldn't do it so often that it could get conventionalized. And so that must be a salient aspect of the meaning for the speakers. And again, this is a general principle of human behavior, that the things that we will do in life are those things that are important to us. Grammaticalization is of constructions because constraining interpretation is situation specific, not word specific. And once conventionalized, again, as in other aspects of culture, it can be extended in use beyond the initial prototype use. And this is one of the interesting things about construction, is that once you have a construction, and grammaticalization, I argue also is just of construction. But once you have the construction, it can take on a life of its own, just like other things. So once I have the construction, I can use it for other things within language. So like we use an interrogative form to give an order, the so-called indirect speech acts. This is a simple way of explaining indirect speech acts. It's just once we have a construction, we can do whatever we want for it. And it's important to infer the speaker's intention. That's really all that's involved there. But this is true also of other tools. So a hammer looks the way it looks because it was designed for hammering nails, but that doesn't mean I can't use it as a doorstop. It makes a very effective doorstop. So we can do things beyond their use. And constructions themselves also, one of the interesting things is when they get extended in use. Adele, I think, has talked about this one, this type of thing, where you can say, like, he sneezed the napkin off the table. Or one of the things that I've talked about in the past is the expression, beat the hell out of something or somebody. where that kept getting extended in my own usage. I was using it for all kinds of things, to the extent that I even said that when I was selling my car one time, I said I babied the hell out of my car. So once you have the thing, you can extend it in its different usage. Now, the constructions that we find in languages can differ in three ways. Do they constrain or not constrain the interpretation of particular conceptual space? For example, Chinese has no grammatical marking of the time of an event relative to the deictic center. That is, there are no constructions for marking tense. English has several constructions for marking tense, so there's a difference in whether or not they mark that particular conceptual space or constrain that particular space. And then the second part is, if they constrain the interpretation of a particular conceptual space, how much do they constrain it? So, for example, English constrains the interpretation of tense to past, present, and future. Japanese constrains the interpretation of past versus non-past. In Rawang, a language I worked on in Kachin State in northern Myanmar, constrains the interpretation to non-past and 4 degrees of past tense. So, depending on how far you are in the past, whether it's a couple of hours ago or 6 hours ago, not exactly 6 hours, but like within today, but more than 2 hours ago, whether it's like a couple of days ago or a couple of years ago, you have to mark those differently. So that's a different degree to which we constrain past tense between English and Rawang. And the third aspect is, if they constrain the interpretation of a particular aspect of a conceptual space, how do they constrain it? So in English, for example, if a speaker wants to say something like he's washing his hair, sorry that my slides are not always clear because I converted this from PDF to PowerPoint, and it kind of got messed up a little. So if somebody wants to say he's washing his hair, the speaker must constrain the interpretation by putting a possessor, using a possessor construction on the noun there, the word hair. In the same situation, though, a Rawang speaker or a French speaker would be required to constrain the identification of the possessor of the hair, but would use a reflexive or middle voice construction. Now, I mentioned French and Rawang. They're both using a kind of middle voice construction, but the way that they do it is again different. So we can also break this down as Croft talks about, with different strategies. So you have the same kind of function, but you're a different kind of strategy. Now Nick had asked me how this relates to animal communication. Is human communication special? And my answer is that human communication is not special in kind. Primates and some other animals communicate in the same way we do, in other words, using inference, but don't have the same degree of inferential abilities. They have smaller frontal lobes. Most of this inferential stuff is going in the medial frontal lobe there, and do not have the physiological capability for the range of sounds that we can produce. So they are communicating, and if you look at the studies of primates in the wild, not the ones in labs, but you look at the ones in lab, in the wild, there's quite a lot of very good evidence of communication going on, and coordinated action. Hunting, not only like chimps and things, but porpoises and as well, dolphins. Some final remarks. I'm running out of time. Actually, probably out of time. I promised Nick I would keep it short. The view I'm presenting here is that the fundamental aspect of communication is not the linguistic structure, but the interaction of the communicator and the addressee in performing a communicative activity. The role of the context in the performance of this activity involving the interpretation of utterances is not to supplement semantic meaning. The context is the base on which all communicative activity and meaning creation depends. That is, rather than saying that the context constrains the interpretation of linguistic form, I argue that it's the linguistic form that constrains the creation of the context of interpretation, much like using a spoon constrains the activity of eating. Much work in pragmatics is focused on examples of language that are ambiguous because of the assumption that language usually presents fully deterministic meaning. But that's not the case. The basic nature of communication is that it's non-deterministic, as it's inference-based, and it's based on non-deterministic inference. And so we should be focusing on how speakers try to get addressees to create particular meanings by constraining the interpretation in particular ways that lead to the conventionalization of the different linguistic constructions. The idea of separating language not only from context, but from human behavior altogether. For example, seeing linguistics as the scientific study of language, as if language is some object that we can study independent of anything else, rather than the study of communicative behavior, is short-sighted and has limited our ability to see what's actually going on. Throughout the history of modern linguistics, linguists have been trying to make linguistics scientific, but the idea of what is scientific and how to do that has changed. In the early 20th century, being influenced by logical positivism, that meant ignoring meaning and attempting the reductionist analysis of structure and coming up with laws and postulates and things like that. The mistake was seeing science as defined as for simple sciences like physics and chemistry. But the phenomenon we're interested in is a complex phenomenon. Like other behavioral sciences, not amenable to the same methods. You cannot reduce things. You cannot use this reductionist approach. Another mistake was assuming the complexity and the meaning was in the form. The form is actually simple. It's just a string of sounds. It is our interpretation and our analysis that's complex. I argue in a more recent paper for a return to the romanticist view of linguistics as being about trying to understand the worldview of the speakers and how that's manifested in their communicative behavior. I teach this in 2 courses at NTU, the university I'm at. One where I present the theory and show how it can deal with many of the issues that have been problematic for structuralist linguistics and for analytic philosophy. And another comparing languages using the method of comparison I just mentioned, but also looking for cultural and real-world causes of those patterns. And the students love these courses because it makes linguistics real for them. And it helps them to understand their own and other meaning creation and behavior more generally. You know, they have them go out every week, they have to write about their own experience in meaning creation and notice things like their habits, like, you know, what factors cause them to create a certain meaning in a certain context. Why does communication go wrong sometimes? And they see this as incredibly useful, and they say linguistics is everywhere. And they often complain, why weren't we taught this in year 1? Because I teach it in year 4 when they're about to graduate, and then they finally learn something that they feel is useful. I think I'll just end it there and say thank you very much. And actually, this is a very, very short description of a very big kind of idea where I normally have a lot of examples. This is normally a 6-hour lecture that I've tried to condense down into 45 minutes or so. But I have a full course on this, videos of the full course of this at this website here. You can scan or click on the link and access the full course on this called The Creation of Meaning. Okay, thank you very much. I want to thank also Nick for inviting me and for his kind invitation again, his invitation and his introduction. And so thank you very much.
Of course, thank you very much, Randy. I'm sure everyone will join me in applauding however you go. The vibe of the together, unfortunately, there are pluses and minuses of this medium, as we all know.
Right.
Please put your comments in the chat, or at least just let us know that you have a question. So we have a little bit of time for some Q&A. And I'll just start. You were kind of thinking about what you might want to ask. I have a question about the difference between human language and other animal communication forms. So, you know, you were pretty clear that you thought there was no difference apart from, you know, I mean, in terms of the meaning piece. But I want to just ask you about one difference, and that's one that my colleague Jack Sidnell in anthropology at Toronto has been trying to convince me for years, and I think he's now succeeded, is that one really fundamental, important feature of human language is its capacity to refer to itself.
Yeah,
and
as Michael Silverstein also talked about that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, many people have made that point. I mean, Jakobsen as well. But the link that I think is really important is that it connects us to, it's arguably the mechanism by which we get norms in a society. So we can look at, so for example, you said that a hammer could be used as a doorstop, and that's obviously true, but can notice that and say, oh, that's a funny thing to do with a hammer or you know, whatever. But the possibility of drawing attention to some practice, whether it's, you know, cultural or linguistic, is, and then evaluating it, you know, as being exceptional or strange or whatever, is seems to only be possible because language is able to be turned back on itself. So you can have, you know, repair systems, you can have linguistic ideology, you can have kind of all of the things that help to regulate norms. So do you think that somehow animal communication systems also have that reflexive capacity, but we don't see it, or do you think, what's your sort of sense of that?
That's something, yeah, we can't really see. It's not observable because they're not, they don't have the capability to express things the way we do it. But so my point is simply just that they are using inferential communication the way we do. But yes, the point you make is the same thing like Michael Silverstein in two papers from the 70s, 76 paper on shifters and his 79 paper on linguistic ideologies. In the 76 paper in particular, he says that the one thing that makes human language unique is this self-referential ability. But we don't really know what's going on in the heads of the other animals. We can only observe their behavior, and we don't see them doing this, so we don't know whether they do it. But from my point of view, that is one thing that we can do with language once we've developed the language forms, but it's not something separate from this inherent ability to communicate using inference is what I'm, you know, so for me, the core ability, so when I see what people are arguing about whether language, animals have language or not, that's like a red herring. And this is what Van der Waal also argued, that that's not the issue. The issue is, can they communicate? And they certainly do communicate. And they do communicate using the same ostensive inferential communication. So like a mother chimp will kind of do this to get the baby chimp to jump on its back, right? So they'll do some kind of motion that the baby can then infer that, okay, the mother is telling me to jump on its back. So this is not different in kind from what we do, but it is certainly different in terms of the particular actions that we do in order to communicate. So the ostensive acts can be much more developed, and to the extent that they can be self-referential. Yeah. So there is that difference. Yeah. So I'm not saying they're 100% the same. All I'm saying is that they are similar. They're the same in kind in terms of being based on inference.
Okay. Okay. Interesting. So there is a question there. Zhao Xiaoliang, is it? Do you want to
wait? Let me pull this up.
Read the question, Randy, or
all right,
I can read it out. You see it?
Let me pull it. Yeah, wait, hold on. I got to pull out the chats here. Should I not say it? Maybe I'll stop sharing so it'll make it easier to see. Yeah. Okay. So Zhao Xiaoliang, thank you, Randy. Can you please briefly talk about how would you see the written language? Does writing have the better chance to decrease the ambiguity in communication? No, actually, it's quite interesting what happens in writing. If you know about the history of writing, writing was not originally used the way we normally use it. It was originally used just as a mnemonic. And they didn't use punctuation, and they didn't use spaces. They didn't use anything like that. But they found that it's really very difficult to understand. Only later on, in fact, this is why Plato criticizes writing. He thinks it makes people lazy because then they don't have to memorize as much. And you know, so if you look at work by George Goody, not George Goody, what was Goody's? I can't think of the Cambridge anthropologist worked on
Jack Goody.
writing. Jack Goody, yeah, Jack Goody, thanks. you look at his how he talks about how writing has changed the way we think about language. And I myself work with non-literate people who really think about language very differently because they're not literate. In other words, for them, language is real. It's not an object thing. So like you're talking about this self-referentiality, actually more likely among people who are literate, because you're kind of making the language this object of inquiry. Whereas I found working like with the Chiang people, this old guy I worked with who hadn't been out of the mountains for 30 years, he could not think of language as an object of inquiry. For him, it was all just real, and it was all meaning. There was no way to really think about the form. I couldn't say something like, how do you say, Jack went out to his field, and he'll say, you can't say that. And I say, why? Well, Jack doesn't have a field. One time he was telling me a story, and I was writing down a story, and I wanted to see if I changed something in the story, like how the negation will work or something like that. And then I said, could you say that? He said, no, you can't say that. I said, why not? He said, because that's not the way the story went. For him, this was all history. And so you had to get everything right. So getting back to the question though, so writing started out just as a mnemonic in both in Greece and in China. And so like the oldest book in Chinese, like Shangshu, is really just a record of people's speeches. And later on, people started treating it a different way, but then they found that if they tried to read it cold without knowing what the text was originally, then they had real trouble. So then they put in punctuation, and punctuation really is a replacement for intonation. And now we have emoji, which are a replacement for a face, because faces are so important in interaction. And so you can see that it's really about individual interaction. And we try to kind of make up for the things that we lose when we move to writing on paper or computers or whatever. But it's never going to be the same. You can try to be more explicit, and people do try to be more explicit when they write. But you can never, you're always going to be more ambiguous in the sense that you don't have intonation. So one of the problems with linguistics is often, even within constructionist approaches, they often ignore the intonation. The only one who really kept faith with intonation was Halliday and Bill Graves, and making sure that when you analyze the whole, everything together, because it's all part of one ostensive act. And I would say you have to include the gesture as well. Okay.
So,
any other questions?
I might, while people are thinking, I'd invite you all to jump in. One kind of little question that comes up for me, maybe it's a big question, I don't know, but you gave that example of pointing to the chair, and saying toilet to communicate that the person had gone out of the room and why. And I found that a really interesting case, and it reminded me of cases I've looked at where, for example, people in the part of Laos where I'm working, they know a lot of names for different tree species, and they actually use these words. One of the frequent things they do with these words is to talk about location, to talk about where someone was or where something happened. So they're actually not really interested in the tree.
Well, you cut out. Oh, I've lost you, Nick. I don't hear you anymore.
Okay.
There you go. Now you're
can
back.
You hear me yet?
Yeah, now you're back.
But the basic question is, if the word, in your example, if the word toilet was gaining all of its meaning from context, surely that can't be 100% true. It has to have some anchored meaning. There's got to be some lexicon, some kind of psychological baseline for the meaning to distinguish it from all the other words that could have been used. So, because you like to put this point quite strongly, but I assume you mean underneath it all that there is something like a mental lexicon.
Not a fixed mental lexicon, but there is our knowledge of how words have been used in the past. and there are marked and unmarked uses that we are experiencing in the past. But first of all, this doesn't prevent us from understanding it totally new in a context. So like say, for example, one time when I was shopping for a shirt in a store in Australia. And at that time I was quite a lot heavier than I am now. And the guy was trying to sell me a fitted shirt. And I said, I'm too fat to wear a fitted shirt. And he said, oh, I've known men more generous than you wear fitted shirts and look good. And so that's, of course, the first time I've ever heard the word generous used to mean fat. But I could totally understand what he meant in that context, because not because of certainly my understanding of how generous is often used, the kind of unmarked uses of generous, helped me to helped me in that inference that what he's referring to there as being fat. And then each time we use the word, it's slightly different. So we have memory of how words have been used in the past, and that's all part of our context of interpretation that we bring to bear when we understand that particular situation that we're trying to understand, that particular stimulus.
Right. So I noticed that Avery had a comment. Since other questions haven't come up, can I call on Avery to speak to that comment?
Yeah. Hi, Avery, if you're still there. But yeah, not so much.
Oh, he's
not
here,
so much.
yeah.
Although
he's there he comes.
yeah. Oh, hi. I'm not so much influenced by Dwight Whitney, but certainly 19th century. My paper that I mentioned, the 2020 paper, is very much Humboldt and that whole Romanticist school going up through Boas, Sapir, Worf, whatnot. I consider myself part of that whole lineage. In fact, Mary Haas was Sapir's student. Jim Matisoff was Mary Haas's student, and I'm Jim Matisoff's student. So actually, there is a lineage there. But even in terms of my intentions of trying to understand the world view of the speakers, which is what Boas and Sapir and Humboldt were all about. And Humboldt argued very clearly that it's action, that language is action, it's not a thing. So Humboldt really had a lot of it together. And so that's why in that paper, I'm kind of arguing that we should kind of rediscover our earlier roots in Humboldt.
Yes, okay, am I audible now?
So it looks like Avery's audible. Yes,
okay,
Avery,
yeah.
far away.
I don't see you.
Whitney, yeah, okay, I don't have my video on. I want to try to fix that. Or do I?
It was a young woman in your picture a minute ago.
Okay.
Oh, there you are. You're a little bit upside down.
So Whitney sort of was very influenced by geology. Okay. Brother was a geologist. And so he had this idea, which reminded me of what you were saying earlier, of language is kind of like, you think of it as a big collection of habits. Well, a typical geological thing would be the formation of a valley. Okay, by a little bit of water runs down the slope and so on and so on and so forth. And what happens next depends on what's happened before. So it seems,
that's very much.
It seems quite consistent with what you were saying. And Silverstein wrote a book about Whitney. So, but because he was into more geological metaphors than biological ones, I think. So.
Oh, that's really good. I'm going to look into that. It's a funny coincidence because Boas was also a geologist.
Well, the historical sciences.
Interesting connection there.
I think that
I have to look into
biologists, and my impression was that linguists, biologists, and geologists used to talk to each other more in the 19th century.
Right. Everybody used to talk to each other more in the 19th century. Now we have silos.
Although I probably think that there is something funny about language, which basically is this ridiculously large inventory of constructions. And, do chimpanzees have, and of course we can use it to talk about things that aren't there. So a dog can lead you to where it wants you to go, but it can't tell you how to get there.
Right. Well, it's the same with their other tools. So if you look at the chimpanzees use tools, so they have a, they can use a stick to pull ants out of an ant mound, or they can use a rock to break open nuts. So they have a very simple set of tools for eating, whereas we have very complex tools, and that also differs among cultures. So a Chinese friend of mine actually thought Westerners are not very bright because we need so many tools in the kitchen. The Chinese just need the wok and the spatula, and they can make anything they want to make. Whereas the Westerners need all these specialized tools, and they're saying like, what's that all about? So it's just a difference of how many tools do you feel you need. So some languages, like David Gill talking about Riau Indonesian, not needing so much constraining of the interpretation, and it may differ with the type of society you have, as Peter Trudgill has talked about.
He only talked about sailing a boat. Okay, so what do you mean? What kind of tools do you need to make a boat? Okay, what linguistic tools? What kind of linguistic tools do you need to survive in Australia?
Right.
Okay, I think to survive in Australia, you need to preserve vast amounts of knowledge, probably for centuries, to deal with the long-term variations in the climate.
Right, yeah.
And so that is sort of, I guess I see it as that somehow or other humans crossed some divide whereby hoarding information was usually a bad idea, and somehow we went crazy on sharing it. And of course,
no, there's some very interesting work that shows that knowledge is not an individual thing. It's a societal thing. That we shouldn't try to learn everything ourselves. That's never the way it's been. It's always been a societal thing. That knowledge is a societal thing, and that takes a lot of pressure off us, because I always tried to understand everything myself. Stressful.
Also, I think we're terrible at thinking. All we do is use our recipes.
Well, that's habit too. Yeah, it's. I mean, evolutionarily.
Can I call on? Sorry, I broke up a bit there. Can I call on Lila? So Lila Samrock said in the chat box that she has a question. So can I ask you to pose your question?
Hi, ask me to pose. Yeah, thanks. Hi, thanks, Randy. I was just curious about your, and it was a bit of it was a kind of an aside in a way, but about your remark that you felt that writing helped to turn language into an object. But I was curious about how you think that gels with the extremely kind of elaborate verbal art and language focused kind of art that is often found in highly oral societies as well.
Well, yes. So in oral societies, you have oral traditions, but this is what the interesting thing that Goody talked about. So what happens is Goody talks about how, like with the Greeks, for example, they originally had lots of different versions of Homer and these other oral literature. And once they started writing, they started comparing the different versions because then they had them in front of them and they could start comparing them. And this is where history comes from. So the word history in Greek, historia, means to investigate. So what they started doing is once they had it there as an object, they started investigating what was true, what was false, how the different versions differed, and then deciding, okay, which is the correct one. And so this is when mythology and history got separated. And so this also led to basically, he argues it leads to all of our ideas about science and breaking it down into all these different ways. It's quite interesting work. But in terms of traditionally, there was literature. So like the old Chang guy that I mentioned, he was in the Chang culture, there are designated storytellers because this is their history. And you have to do it well. You have to, what we say, you have to have a teacher who agrees to teach you the stories, and you have to get it right. Otherwise, your teacher will lose face and you will lose face and the stories will be messed up. So these were really important stories. Now, the point is, though, that it was really about meaning. It wasn't exact form.
But don't you think that a lot of those verbal art forms require a very, very high awareness of form? If you consider the sort of parallelism and the sort of typical tropes that are used in storytelling, don't you think that's a different way to sort of think about language acting on language?
Yeah. So in some cultures, yeah, you have like in the E culture, in the language areas I'm more familiar with, in the Tibetan family, you have these very regimented kind of 4 or 6 syllable patterns, or in Chinese also, the old poems in Chinese, kind of regimented into a pattern that makes it easy to remember. So these things act as mnemonics. But what I meant by it's really about meaning is, at least with the Chiang guy that I was working with, he didn't memorize things word by word. It was almost like he just had like keywords, key concepts. And so what he remembered was just the key concepts of along the way, and then he would embellish that. And for him, the embellishing was just sound for him. The important thing was those key concepts, that you get those key concepts across. But in terms of those who have these more regimented types of things, there are, again, they end up with lots of different versions. I work, one of my side things is I actually work on ancient Chinese texts of particularly of the Taoist schools. So I've been going through a dozen or so different versions of the Tao Te Ching and looking at how these things have been transmitted and the changes that have happened over time as people transmit them. And these of course probably were done orally before they were written down. And so one of the questions we have when we look at all the different versions is, were the changes brought in with after writing or before writing, or were these just because of different oral things, and just they were transcribed differently because of people had different interests or whatever. So these are all interesting questions. I don't have a totally complete answer for it.
Yeah, it sounds fascinating. Thank you.
Can I bring up another question that kind of comes back to the maybe it's a bit related to the written language, but not about writing, but not as a technology. But you said during the talk, we use the ostensive act most likely to facilitate the inferential process of the hearer. So you're sort of appealing to this idea that we, if we want to send a signal, we want to make it easy for the person to come to the conclusion that we want them to come to, right? So I wonder what you say about academic writing. So, together with students, I've been lamenting, I'm always lamenting about how terrible academic writing is. And it seems to be designed to make it hard, if not impossible, to facilitate, the desired inferential processes. So how do you explain that?
That is definitely true. I mean, I always used to read Chomsky to try to sleep because it was so badly written. My own writing, and like Van, if he's still there, his writing is always very clear and straightforward. And people don't take you seriously if you write very clear and straightforward. I found this, like my students also, even though my classes I'm teaching them a whole lot of stuff, because they can understand it easily, they call this, they think the class is too easy. So they say my classes are the slackest classes in the program. When actually it's not that they're not learning anything, it's just that it's easy for them to learn. And so then they don't take it that seriously. Whereas if they're forced to take it's very hard for them to understand, and they have to take a lot of tests and all this other stuff then that they can't pass, then they think that's somehow, I don't know, more erudite or something. But this is certain people write something very difficult. Think of Michael Silverstein, writes in a very difficult style that's worth reading. And then other people write in a very difficult style that's not really worth reading because there's really nothing there. It's just like, if you think about a lot of postmodernist literature, postmodernist criticism, I mean, they just like to string a whole bunch of words that sound intelligent, but it's not really saying a whole lot. So that it's a technique within academia to do this. It's one way of trying to sound more erudite. But as a Japanese friend asked me, she said, does erudite mean full of errors? And I said, well, sometimes, yeah.
I like that. I think that's a good gloss of erudite. That's very good.
Right.
Okay. So we, time is marching on. I'm not sure how much longer we have, but we could certainly take another question if someone's keen to put their hand up.
Well, Mark had one in the chat. Mark posed.
All right,
so
let's go. Let's go to Mark and.
Oh wait, now he's got a second one. So Mark, can you just make which one you want to do?
Are you there, Mark?
All right. Sorry. Well, okay. So I don't know if we want to get into this, but so I didn't finish typing it. Should I read it? Granted that human communication and cognition are built over precursor primate systems, and that holistic expressions in both, so something like I'm happy or smiling and laughing, they're basically the same. The context is the same, interpretation, the process is basically the same. And granted that bonobos at least can be taught to comprehend basic non-clause structures, so just things like put the pine needles in the refrigerator for kanzi, so we can get that far. You can't get as far as complex structures. So you can't get as far as combining two clauses. Go over there and put the pine needles in the refrigerator or something like that. So since I realize time's short, I'm just going to cut to the chase. Is there nothing qualitatively different in that? I mean, so Chomsky in 2010, I think it was, proposed that the only thing that's different between us and the bonobos is merge. And leaving all that baggage aside, there does seem to be a qualitative difference there, or is that simply quantitative? Is there just simply a quantitative difference between that in terms of our, overall general knowledge, intelligence? To get to that.
Well, again, even with this idea of merge, which is, again, it's a little bit slippery. A lot of people have commented that merge is actually more general, to animals as well. It's just basically putting two things together. It's all merge really is. So in this case, though, as I argued, the basis of the communication is what I'm arguing is that the basis of communication is inference. And so, and I do say that in terms of the ostensive acts that we can do are very different because of the difference in our brain structure and the difference in our physiological structure. So we cannot, they cannot do everything we can do. There's no question about that. And that's why I said it's a red herring to even ask that question. I'm not criticizing you for asking it, but a lot of people make a big deal out of just because they can't, speak the Queen's English, then that's a huge difference. But what I'm focusing on is not whether or not they can do that. They can, of course, not do that. They cannot. They definitely can't do that, and I can't speak English either. But they can do inferential communication, and that was my point. And it's done in the same way that we do, and they do collaborate. So, like again, the important point is looking at animals in the wild, because like Tomasello, for example, in his earlier work, he was just looking at animals in captivity, and he had one opinion about how they cooperate or not. But then later on, when more people, Sefer and others, were doing wild communication, wild observation, then totally different facts came out. It's just like looking at natural linguistic data versus, making up your own sentences. You really find out a lot more when you go to a natural situation, and they're reacting to situations that they need to react to. And so then you see how they're actually doing it. And there you do find quite a bit of communication. And like I said, coordination, there are lots of videos online of, chimps and porpoises and dolphins coordinating to hunt and do other things together. So somehow they have a way of letting each other know what's going on. And we don't know exactly how they do it, but there are certain similars. They also pass on culture. They have, each community has developed certain tools and certain ways of achieving certain goals, and those can get passed on through the generation. So there's obviously some kind of transmission going on there as well. So it's really just a difference in degree rather than kind, I think.
So that's the answer. It is quantitative, not qualitative.
Right. Yeah.
Thank you.
Right. Well, that's a very interesting and still not uncontroversial point to end on. So I'd be very, very keen to see continued discussions around that. But normally we would be wrapping up around this time, so we will do that. I just want to thank all the people for tuning in. So we had a really great crowd. Thanks to Randy, of course, for making that happen. And I'm really pleased to see some familiar faces. And this is one of the things about Zoom. You get this fantastic kind of international audience, but then unfortunately you can't, go and have coffee afterwards with some of the people who you haven't seen for a while. So, hopefully these events will lead people to kind of email each other and catch up with each other. So we'll leave it there. And I just want to thank Randy once again for a really interesting and stimulating talk. And I hope you'll all join me in applauding him. I get my little reaction there. So there you go. Thanks very much, Randy.
And thanks you, everyone. Guys. Thanks everybody for your questions and for your participation. Okay. And thanks again, Nick, for inviting me. Okay. So take care, everybody. Stay well.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.